University in the UK. And I will be chairing this session and also speaking first in this session, so I better stick to time. All of our presenters will have 20 minutes each to talk, followed by 10 minutes of questions, which I will chair, but please do participate in the chat, in the conversation throughout as well. If I can ask everyone just to make sure their videos and microphones are off unless they're speaking, and then I will just start my screen and start my presentation as well. Karen, can you just nod your head if you can see those slides? Is that okay? Yeah. Great. Okay, excellent. So let's start my timer. Hi, everyone. As I said, my name's Sam Hingworth. I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University. And today I'm going to be presenting work I have done along with my colleague, Marita Grimwood, who's now at Advanced HE. And this work is called Learned Words, a poetic content analysis of belonging in higher education. So I want to just start off with the research question for this piece of work, which was basically, how can poetry help to explore a sense of belonging for staff working in higher education? But I'd like to offer an alternative research question, which is in the form of a poem. So this is a poem by the poet Lydia Davis called A Position at the University, which I will read, but I've got the text up as well. I think I know what sort of person I am, but then I think, but this stranger will imagine me quite otherwise when he or she hears this or that to my credit. For instance, that I have a position at the university. The fact that I have a position at the university will appear to mean that I must be the sort of person who has a position at the university. But then I have to admit with surprise that after all, it is true that I have a position at the university. And if it is true, then perhaps I really am the sort of person you imagine when you hear that a person has a position at the university. But on the other hand, I know I am not the sort of person I imagine when I hear that a person has a position at the university. Then I see what the problem is. When others describe me this way, they appear to describe me completely, whereas in fact they do not describe me completely. And a complete description of me would include truths that seem quite incompatible with the fact that I have a position at the university. And I just know that the first time I read that poem, I felt very seen. And I just think that it sums up a lot of maybe the identities that many of us feel, no matter what our role working within higher education. I wanted to try and explore some of that with poetry. So a lot of the work and research that I do is around using poetry as a way to explore topics. And this is a methodology that I've developed and that we use in this particular research, which I would call poetic content analysis. So begin by formulating a research question, which I shared with you there. How can poetry help to express a sense of belonging for staff working in higher education? Then go about reading the poems. So either you use poems that already exist around a certain topic, or you elicit poems. And in this particular case, we invited colleagues working in higher education institutes to write poems that addressed this research question. There was no limit. They could write whatever they wanted to. It was completely anonymized. We didn't take any identifying information, and we got ethical clearance from Edinburgh Napier University Ethics Committee. Marita and I basically, for those of you who are au fait with thematic content analysis, we basically treated the poems as data. So both of us went through individually, read the poems, cleaned them first of all to remove any identifying information, and then assigned codes. And we're quite broad with this. I guess the only difference is that one of the things you wouldn't do with poem is you wouldn't necessarily assign more than one code to a single line. And Marita and I did that individually, and then we met up to compare our codes and to group them into broad categories, which I'll share in a minute. And then, as with any qualitative research strategy, we had to confirm trustworthiness, which was done mostly through quite fastidious data auditing, and also seeing whether or not we had data saturation, were there any new emergent codes or categories, and then going back once we'd done the codes and categories individually to make sure that all of the emergent categories spoke to the poems and that there were none newly emergent from that. And then once we had the categories again, which I'll talk about, we just looked about what these meant, looked for poems that fit quite neatly into these, contextualized that with the surrounding literature, and then came up with some recommendations as well, which I'll share at the end of this presentation. So in terms of the 4 emergent categories or narratives, as I've called them here, there were 4 really. There was community, exclusion, transformation, and self. So community we define to be those poems or sections of poems which explore self and identity in relation to others, both positively and negatively. And here you can see the codes. So those codes that I'd originally called supported community, so SI is me, Sam Illingworth, MG is Marita Grimwood, appreciation, validation, judgment, conformity, family, and competition. We felt that these all quite neatly fit under community. Then there's exclusion, which are those that we defined as being explores self as distant and or alienated from others. Transformation, change within self, community, or relationship between the two. And self, questions of individual emotion and or identity. And I think the best way really of representing what these narratives or categories look like is to give you some excerpts from some of the poems. So first thinking about community, which again can be positive or negative. So an excerpt from poem 1. Call it a jungle, line up at watering holes, watch out for big beasts, the ones you need to review papers and performance. Just remember you'll need a hand up. No academic is an island. Knowing terms, global challenges require working teams. Just choose yours carefully or draw on the right straw and watch your students grow. And secondly, from poem 9, but I'm behind this screen. Those emails won't delete themselves. Those students don't grade themselves. They grade us. They grade me if I don't answer emails. And I'm sure many of us can see ourselves in several of these poems. I think what was really interesting about community, as well as the community amongst colleagues and that element of competitiveness stroke collaboration that many of us often find ourselves on the precipice of, was the students. I mean, we didn't explicitly ask any staff to talk about students, but almost all of them spoke about students in their poems. And the fact that we, as staff members working in higher education, exist with and alongside the students as community, not separate to them. And that was something that was quite interesting to come out of this work. I know that's nothing new, but I think sometimes we need reminding that the students as community don't exist over here. They exist in the university of which we are a part and of which we are one. So exclusion. And again, I guess I should have said a content warning. There's nothing explicitly rude or insulting in this, but people might find potential triggers with some of the ideas that are generated in these poems. An invisible bubble popping after 5 days, leaving 4 hats behind, teaching, research, service, outreach, just one head to wear them. And several of the poems really explored this idea, not only of workload management, but also where one fits within that university environment, depending on what hat one is wearing on a particular day or not. And then from poem 10, I seek opportunities where I see myself happy. I seek opportunities where I see myself valued. I seek opportunities where cis white men are not the sole decision makers. I seek opportunities where the foundational roots are not inherently racist, sexist, classist. Surely they exist. Surely I will be welcomed. Surely I will feel safe. I hope. And many of the poems really explored this element of structural exclusion, be that through misogyny or racism. And there were certain incidents that were there, but there was this larger structural exclusion that many staff explored that was there. And I think what was really interesting was the poems was that the amnesty that this created was a space in which people felt that they could really be true. I mean, obviously there was no interviewer bias, but I think the fact that when one's writing a poem, you think about the meaning of every line in a way that you don't necessarily do when you're giving an interview response or given a survey. I wouldn't imagine many people go back and edit the survey responses that they give to a particular research, whereas it's clear that, you know, several of these poems, as well as being very cathartic and reflective, are also quite aesthetically pleasing. And I think that the quality of that engagement really speaks volume, I think, for the research methodology as well. So transformation, and again, all of these categories really can be thought of as elements of positive and negative in there as well. I ran away from home to university. It was an acceptable escape. After being more terrified than I thought was possible, I found a new me, and then I never left. And I think that that's really powerful and empowering as the university as a space that many people who might exist on fringes of other communities or other environments feel as though there is a home for them in the university environment, despite how difficult it can be. I guess contrast to that, 25 years on and I'm still in higher education, now a doctor, senior lecturer, course leader, sole breadwinner, house owner, proud to be me, but still higher education is not for the likes of me. And again, many of these poems, as we'll come on to in Self, explored not only issues of imposter syndrome and self-identity, but the fact that they were very much made to feel, again, through the structures, that higher education wasn't a place for them. And as you can imagine, it wasn't white cisgendered males that were writing these particular poems. And then the final category, Self. It makes me believe in myself and provides validation for my skills, so that stopping would leave me on a shelf, unhappy. And again, this points not only to personal experiences, but to the literature as well, that for many of us working at in higher education institutes are very much vocations. And, you know, thinking about my own positionality and something very privileged to do and doesn't feel like a job a lot of the time. But then at the same time, those blurred lines that exist and the extent to which we, if we go back to that original poem from Lydia Davies, that we very much, or many staff working in higher education institutes, construct their identities around their job, which isn't necessarily healthy and which we don't necessarily see in other non-vocational careers as well. So I think really exploring that idea of self and how it can be very empowering, but also potentially very dangerous and damaging, and also maybe limiting as well, really came through in these poems. And then finally, and there was always humor in these poems as well. Do I belong behind this screen? They say I'm perfect for this job. I think I'm perfect for the couch and a cup of hot tea. And all of these poems, which we all also, I'll share them in the chat, but we also have a poetry amnesty site called Learned Words, where we invited people who contributed poems to this study to share their poems anonymously on there as well. And it's just, for me at least, reading these poems, as well as it being just a very interesting research project, which I'll come to some of the findings in a second, it was also very cathartic and also very positive in a sight, in that even though many of the issues I didn't experience, some of the issues I did, and being able to see other people experiencing that really does remind you that, you know, we aren't an island and that other people do experience these issues as well. So the main limitations from this project were that there was quite a small sample size, so limited to a single sample of poems, so 18. I mean, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of what's too much or too little for qualitative research, but I think that, you know, if we were looking at semi-structured interviews, necessarily think that 18 was too small an amount. And even though some of these poems were shorter, Some were quite long. I don't think it necessarily means that there's not enough. It's just that maybe more would be interesting as well. Obviously, poetry is very subjective. So both Marita and I brought our own positionality to the analysis of those poems, again, which we'd see through any qualitative research analysis, but maybe more so in poetry. Having a second coder or second researcher really helped to address some of that generalizability, but maybe having more, and again, making sure that there's a very, very clear audit trail, etc., is really important to enabling that to take place. And another limitation was that only English language poems were there, because even though Marita speaks multiple languages, I only really speak English to a level where I feel comfortable analysing poetry. So this potentially creates a bias towards certain attitudes or behaviours or even participants as well. So thinking about moving forward, having this to a wider scope and inviting multiple languages and maybe author-sanctioned translations as well would be interesting. So despite these limitations, I think there are a number of recommendations that came out of this project in terms of meaningfully addressing belonging in higher education. I know that many people in the room do lots of great work on this already, but really from the poems, it's clear that there's need to focus on nurturing a sense of community, and with it the capacity to engender action. So basically not just assuming that communities will self-organize within an institute, but creating a space in which they can, and also thinking about where the student body fits into that as well. And I think through the poems as well, what came out was not just a community for community's sake, but a community that can action. So yeah, they can be talking shops, but also what's the purpose of them? What are they going to result in? Are they going to result in change? Something that was really clear in the poems was that if higher education institutes truly seek to be places of positive societal benefit that uphold inclusive values, as every single one of their websites tell us that they do, then they should also seek to celebrate and reward these same values amongst their staff. So, really thinking about promotional criteria here. If higher education institutes are telling us that they are EDI compliant, that they're very societally focused, then why are we not rewarding staff outside of traditional research publications grant income? I know that's changing slightly, but it's still not really across the norm, and that came across very strongly through the poems and again the aligned research. 3-minute warning to myself. In addition to this, we need to celebrate these values. Institutes should provide support in helping staff to effectively navigate the substantial number of different qualities that are needed to fulfill a role in higher education. So what do we want from you for research? What do we want from you from teaching? What do we want from you from outreach? What do we want from you from wider participation and admin? Where are the limits? And I think having that, again, would be very important. And then finally, meaningfully recognise and encourage the deep-rooted commitment that is shared by many staff to the potential of higher education for transformative impact. So, it is a vocation. And as I was struck by talking session 1.2 earlier, that, many educators are activists as well. And I think that many of us see the change that's needed and really want to make a difference, but it's necessary in order for that to happen. It really needs there to be a process for that to change from the top down as well as from the bottom up. So they're the key recommendations. From more information can be found on that website here. I just want to read a poem as well to finish off, because we're at a conference, and this is an anonymous poem that was on the website called Inner Monologue at a Conference. A perspex monolith at the edge of town opens its doors to a wave of odious intellect. Glossy signs and fat pamphlets tell me these are the finest minds in humanity. A balding gentleman is bent over himself, struggling to tie his shoelace. The fraying carpets of a previous administration hint at fleeting glories that have since passed. Important-looking notices tell me this is the most vital conference in humanity. Flyers in our welcome pack advertise river cruises and nights at the opera. Free wine and coffee combine to create an atmosphere of compulsory enjoyment. Conference assistants and helpers tell me this is the friendliest conference in humanity. I see a former colleague and bow my head. we pass like kidney stones in the night. Early career researchers skirt the gravitational fields of the professoriate. Coloured ribbons and rainbow badges implore us. This is the most diverse conference in humanity. At the plenary panel, 4 white dinosaurs warn of their extinction. I walk across the cavernous lecture theatre, palms sweating with nervous excitement. The introductory slide sets out my argument. This is the most important topic in humanity. My words trickle through the audience, lost amongst the emails and polite applause. Thank you very much. Very happy to take any questions that people might have, and I can also ask myself them as my role of chair. Let me see if anything's going to be in the chat. Okay, so I'll answer Tim's question, and then if you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand virtually as well. Tim says, I think this is fantastic. Thank you, Tim. In terms of your sample, I wondered if you knew anything about the range of academic disciplines the poets came from, and whether you had any thoughts about how this might influence the level of comfort and engagement with a method like this. It's a very good question, Tim. No, in a word. But also, I know as a fact that it's not just academics that took part in this research. It was also third space professionals, and people who are tangentially related and work within higher education. I think that could have been pulled out a bit more in a future study as well. And I think that looking at not only discipline, but where those people came from within a country as well, like, so the different types of university structures would be quite interesting as well. So no, but we need to do that in the future work. This is very much a pilot study as well. Sian says that they are very interested, use qualitative thematic analysis, treating the poems as text or data. I wonder if any literary approaches or scholars would bring different insights. It could be an interesting comparative angle on the method. Sian, I think that's very true. And actually, Marita, who comes from that literary background, I have a bizarre academic history. I'm actually a physicist by training, but please don't tell anyone that. We had this quite a long discussion about this, and Marita, I think, brought quite a lot of those insights to it. But I think having somebody else as well with a different background would also really help with that as well. Thank you, Ella, for plugging my book. That's very kind of you. Please read it. It's great. Any other questions that people would like to ask at all? Feel free to raise your hand. Julie says, are you sharing any of the recommendations and or the method with senior leaders in the Institute, and what do they make of it? Thanks, Julie. I have shared it across the, across the Institute in terms of our Centre for Higher Educational Research, but not yet to senior leadership team. I think it's definitely something I should do. This work at the moment is in review. It should be published soon. So I think when that's done, it will hopefully be in a place where we can share that more broadly. Sian asks me, did all my poets want to be anonymous? They didn't. Basically, I just assumed that they would like to, but I think that that's really important. And actually, that on the Learned Words website going forward, which I'd really invite people to contribute their work to as well, I will offer people the opportunity to de-anonymize themselves if they want to, because I think sometimes people having the opportunity to have their voice and name against something can actually be very powerful as well. Melanie asks, hi Sam, this is fascinating work, thank you. I wonder how you might treat a poem that is ironic or satirical in its approach and thematic analysis, just like the one I closed with. How did you manage literary devices that deployed? The last one was very sophisticated, and how you align these to themes beyond the literal words. That is an excellent question, Melanie. So one of the things that we did in this work was tried to pick out lines that were very explicit. So really looking at ones where there was less ambiguity for interpretation, especially thinking about those ones where there is a lot of metaphor or simile or satire, and instead look for lines that were quite clearly speaking about something. And again, that's something that Marita and I had a long conversation about. But another way that we might do this as well is to actually ask the poets themselves to think about some of the ways in which they identified the topics that came through there. But yeah, that's a really great question. So thank you very much for that, Melanie. Okay. I think I've done a reasonable job of chairing my own session and comments. So with that, I will finish. I'll happily take some questions in the chat if people want them as well. And I will hand over to our next speaker. So up next is Karen Gravett, who is going to be talking to us about belonging, agency, and purpose in the digital university. Thank you, Karen.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. Hopefully everything's good and everyone can see my slides and hear and everything's clear. It's a real treat to follow that. I really enjoyed that talk, Sam, and hearing about your work. Really fantastic, creative and rich, nuanced approaches to belonging, and that's hopefully something I want to continue in my talk today. Hopefully thinking about how we can approach this really, really complex topic of belonging and how it plays out in universities with similar insights. So my topic is belonging, agency and purpose in the digital university. And I'm here discussing this research on behalf of also two other colleagues who are happily sleeping at present from Australia, Professor Rola Ajawi and Professor Sarah O'Shea. And we all work together on this research, which explores belonging in higher education. And the work came from a realization that belonging was becoming a really, really hot topic. So we started getting interested in it. And then peculiarly, at the same time, it seemed that this was really becoming on the agenda for a lot of people, which was a surprise to us as well. But huge thanks to the Society for Research in Higher Education for funding this research and enabling us to do this work. So we started then by thinking a little bit about what was happening with this concept of belonging in universities. And it was just fascinating, really, how this graph, for example, shows that in Web of Science publications from the 1990s onwards, the interest and attention being paid to belonging in higher education was really, really rocketing. And there's a number of reasons potentially for this. I think concern post-pandemic about isolation, feelings of disconnection, the changing relationships between campus and student space and where the university is, troubling all these really, really important areas of learning in higher education. At the same time, the real concern of teachers in how we're really looking to increase and foster social justice, but at the same time struggling with increasing cohort sizes and as Sam alluded to, the challenging nature of being a teacher in higher education has led, I think, to this sectoral interest in belonging, which is great, because I hope to argue today that I still think it's a really important concept. But at the same time, we were a little bit concerned when we took a look at some of these the discourses and narratives around how belonging was being understood, that often it wasn't being understood in the rich and nuanced and thoughtful way that we've seen in the previous talk, but actually there was a lot of sort of shorthand discussion about belonging as being something that perhaps underpinned by an assumption that we all share the same interpretation of it. Worryingly still, it's often referred to and connected to ideas of students who are understood as being quite normative in their identities, quite culturally specific depictions of students being campus-based, quite easily able to engage with social and curricular lives of universities. At the same time, we also noted it was being associated with concepts like retention, academic achievement and success in quite an instrumental manner. And at the same time, we observed in the narratives and discourses surrounding this topic that there's an increasing discussion or pressure to somehow be able to measure belonging as a concept and somehow be able to fix and achieve it or offer it to students. And we were a little bit troubled by also the pressure upon educators and teachers to somehow do this. So our sort of where we were coming from was we were really interested in thinking, how can we avoid belonging? You know, universities, we love buzzwords, and Maggie McClure has this fantastic phrase. She talks about the incrustations of buzzwords that pervade contemporary education discourses. And I think belonging still has a lot to offer as a concept, but how can we avoid it joining these incrustations of buzzwords? And the first sort of foray into this area was this conceptual paper, which Rola and I wrote, really engaging theory to sort of unpack belonging as a potentially really nuanced, complex idea. We were also very inspired by this fantastic paper by Kelly Guillot and colleagues, and they really just take apart belonging as anything that we can understand in a simplistic way, and they ask fascinating, fabulous questions like, but what are we wanting students to belong to, and why are we wanting students to belong there? When might belonging be undesirable? What does belonging do? What does it make what does it make possible? And also, how might it constrain? So we wanted to also trouble the boundaries of belonging, moving away from a conception that belonging is uniformly experienced, troubling the notion that's commonly taken for granted that belonging is inherently positive, and particularly destabilizing the idea that belonging is somehow a sensation or an experience or a feeling that can be fixed and can be, finite in its achievableness. We were interested particularly in this research grant to look at the role of the digital and digital spaces and hybrid spaces and learning spaces, and how spaces interwove with students' conceptions of belonging. And we were particularly interested in hearing students' understandings of how they interpreted belonging, to get away a little bit from this sort of conversation between academics and the media, and actually hear from students themselves. And so we asked students, we had 30 students in Australia and the UK, and we asked students, to tell us through interviews. We did semi-structured interviews, but also we asked them to record 5-minute video logs, vlogs on their phones, to show us their learning spaces and to show us we ask them, what do their interactions look like, and how do they understand belonging, and can you show us how you understand and interpret the concept of belonging? You can find, I'm going to talk briefly about the findings today, but you can find our latest work available in 2 papers, 2 open access papers. So the politics of student belonging, where we explore concepts of identity and purpose, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, and also a sister paper where we talk about the role of space and think about how space played out in relational ways in our data. So I wanted to share some findings from this research, and the first thing that came up is this idea that belonging was understood in multiple ways, multiple spaces, and that these spaces and experiences were really fluid. So, for example, we have some information here, a quote here where we talk about, where we talk about how this particular student said, for me, belonging is feeling like you're part of a greater whole, something larger, learning with community for a bigger purpose. So this idea of purpose was really, really important as well. And this student told us that, they really needed to connect, make connections. And the idea of agency really came through as well. So this particular student talked about how if you don't get out of your comfort zone, you will end up being in your room, you will study, you probably will do well, but then you're not going to be connected to the university. University is not just your course, but everything that comes along with it. So it's really fascinating how, when students told us about the connections and the spaces that they enjoyed, this idea of purpose and agency really came through. A similar quote here about this notion of purpose and agency. came through here with this student. And this first student talks about how for them belonging was understood as taking part in wider activities. So this student says, for me, belonging was taking part in a Students as Partners programme. And this was a great way for me to interact with teachers and like-minded students to complete research at the university. Another student told me that how they had been engaging in these kinds of projects, and they said, it's made me feel much more connected to the university and a sense of belonging, because I feel like I'm not just completing my own studies in my degree, but I'm actually contributing to the greater good of the university. So through the data, and there's a lot more insights and quotes that you can see in the papers, but through the data, there was increasingly this idea that students were creating and curating belonging in purposeful ways, in different spaces, different times, through different projects, and that this creation and curation of belonging was something that happened on a micro level, in their rooms with their peers, in a particular specific project, but it was also understood in a broader meta level, so it's connecting to a wider university. So there were a number of insights that came through the research, and mainly one of the key things was this the multiplicity of understanding belonging. Students told us that they engaged in multiple communities, and really these insights tell us that they troubled the boundaries of space, campus, and belonging, really destabilizing belonging as experienced in any singular, uniform way, but students giving different examples of how belonging was understood via different projects, via different spaces, in material ways, in fluid ways, in different relationships as well. So space and belonging was really coming through as something that was very evolving, very multiple, and very fluid. And this led us to think a little bit about how we might move away from this concept that's so prevalent in our conversations about belonging, this concept of the sense of belonging, that actually we might prefer to think about belonging as multiple senses of belonging. So for us, there's no singular definition, there was no singular experience. And this really chimes with how we might think of our own belonging as well. So Sam was alluding to how nuanced and complex it is for us as teachers, as educators with multiple hats, and how complex academic identities are. And I don't think that we would make any assumptions about that belonging not being fluid or fleeting or experienced in different spaces, places, and relationships. But for some reason, when we talk about students and when we talk about fostering belonging for students, we increasingly rely on this idea that belonging can be somehow offered, that belonging can be something that universities do or create for students. But our students were telling us that it was a very purposeful, agentic experience that they were themselves often creating, and also that it was really evolving experience. So students were telling us that they define, curate, and experience multiple belongings in diverse and sophisticated ways. For them, engagement was really mobile and multiple. It was purposeful and personalized. And it was something that students were doing and creating, and it couldn't be guaranteed or fixed. Now, our students also haven't talked a lot about this today, but there's a lot more in the papers. Our students also talked a lot about the discontinuities of belonging. So if we think about belonging as somehow fleeting, evolving, and fluid, then inevitably there's times and spaces when we don't experience a sense of belonging and we experience a sense of non-belonging. And I think what's really, really interesting and important for further work is actually to think a little bit about when those experiences of non-belonging are problematic, i.e. sometimes our students were telling us that belonging was offered or proposed or experienced in, say, societies or extracurricular activities that they couldn't access. So some of our students had caring responsibilities, or they were commuter students, or they just had to work to study, and they were not able to access particular sites and spaces of belonging, and that felt exclusionary. But at the same time, other students told us that actually they'd try a particular society or group and they'd come away thinking, well, that's not my group, I don't connect there. So, and that's fine, I have belonging that I experience in different ways. And that's really fascinating, I think, about how we can unpack the discontinuities of belonging, and when it's okay for students and when it's okay for staff to feel non-belonging, and when it's actually a problem that we need to think about in connection to our work fostering inclusivity. So the study and the research that we've been doing in these 3 papers have really pointing us towards thinking a little bit about how we can continue to use the concept of belonging, but we need to handle it with care. We need to think about belonging as something liminal and ephemeral, something very effective, something that's situated in the space between feelings, experiences, and social structures, an effective atmosphere or connection that we need to understand in very, very careful ways. So I'm increasingly interested in thinking about belonging in this nuanced and complex way. And I really like what Latour says in his work about thinking about not just belonging, but thinking about key ideas and concepts, thinking about them as matters of concern. So this notion of a matter of concern enables us to think about an idea as something that we are curious about, that we want to attend to, that we want to care about, that we want to be concerned about because it matters. But at the same time, within this matter of concern, it embraces all the irregularities and all the complexities and all the different dimensions and elements to the question or to the topic. It's not presented as a matter of fact or something that can have a finite solution or a simple solution, but rather something that we have a complex conversation about and that we attend to with curiosity and care. And I think there's something really, really helpful there in helping us to escape this desire that's natural, that we all have, sort of easily fix, foster and measure wicked challenges in education. So just some thoughts and updates really for those of you that are interested in this research and thinking about belonging in this way. Next steps for us are really to think about how we can further translate the work. So we're really delighted that we have some ESRC funding to work with an artist who is going to create some visuals of our data that we will be sharing. So watch this space. Oh, thanks, Sam. So we're going to be sharing some visuals of the data in order to create further resources for teachers to prompt further, hopefully meaningful and generative discussions about belonging. We want colleagues to recognise the complexity of belonging, and this to feed into institutional discourses across different trajectories, and also to understand better students' conceptualizations of their experiences. Again, bridging that divide that Sam mentioned between students and teachers to share a common language. Future research, I really want to move forward to unpack more about how we might understand the discontinuities of belonging, which belongings are exclusionary, and how we can articulate and support that better. And also we've been doing some work to bring together the experiences of academics and teachers, senses of belonging, and particularly this paper that recently I did with some colleagues in the UK and in Australia, where we explored our own senses of belonging via a collective biography, a storying method, where we could really think about belonging as flickering and flux and how that plays out in academic work. So yeah, so some things and ideas there for you to follow up on. And I'm done now. So thanks so much for listening, and really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Karen. So invite everybody to either raise your hand physically or virtually, or to drop a chat into the questions, and I can read those out. So Karen, just first of all, a question from Charlie, who writes, first of all, some fascinating themes there. And did you see any variation in students' understanding of belonging in higher education amongst the non-traditional groups that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we saw was so much variation across all of our students. We deliberately didn't categorize them according to gender or race or their particular situation, but we just did have a very, very diverse cohort of lots of different students, and that what came through was that, in a nutshell, what you've explained, the sheer diversity of how they conceptualize belonging. So our students talked about how for some of them it was a sense of safety. Lots of them talked about it being something that they created within a particular space, the materiality of belonging. It was having certain things. So students talked about how it was being able to create a safe space at home. It was things like warmth, it was things like having snacks, it was things like having comfortable clothes, a comfortable seat. Other students told us that they really valued different flexible spaces. One of our students was homeless, and they were talking about the fantastic affordances of safe university spaces. There was talk about the real need for connection and belonging with peers. There was also a lot of talk from non-traditional, I'm using that unhappily, that phrase, but from diverse students, about the real affordances of engaging in projects like the partnership project and other projects to actually this feeling that they could have purpose and agency and make an impact, contribute to something on a wider whole. So yeah, it really exploded for me how much belonging is a really massive, multifaceted, thorny concept, a matter of concern, I think, rather than any singular understanding. So yeah, absolutely, the identity and the location and the affordances and the position of students really fed into how they conceptualized it. And what led us then to think is that, okay, that's fantastic that some students are in a position to be able to curate a lovely working space at home, they're feeling warm, they're feeling safe, or they're able to access spaces that work for them at university. But how do we then support belonging for those students that haven't got access to those resources to create those spaces that they need? And how can we make access to the curation or purposeful creation of belonging more equitable? Yeah,
thanks, Karen. I guess a follow-on question from Nikki Hinmarsh then is that, who also comments, a very interesting talk. Rather than, I guess, the personal demographics, did you have students from a variety of courses and disciplines?
Yeah.
And did you find that students with, for example, heavily placement-based studies felt different about belonging? So I guess like midwives and teachers, etc.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we did have diverse disciplines, and also the university sites were really, really diverse. So yeah, we didn't specifically touch upon placements, I don't believe, in the data, but certainly all of the situated experiences of students really informed how they engaged with the university. And for me, that feeds into the real need to think in greater sophistication about the role of non-belonging, because I think in any homogenous conception of what belonging is and how students should engage, we're going to fail to miss the needs of students on placement who need to weave in and out, commuter students, more mature students who have families, who have jobs, who don't want to engage or belong in certain ways and certain spaces. So I think it came through that there's a real need to continue the fantastic work that institutions are doing to foster belonging. They are doing some fantastic initiatives, but also to weave into those initiatives an understanding of the need for diverse conceptions of what it means to belong. And that was really, really apparent. Yeah, absolutely. But belonging as a situated experience.
Could I ask a question, Karen, just because I know you have such a long history of working on belonging. From this particular project, which I guess happened post-COVID, stroke in the middle of COVID, do you think there's been a marked change with student attitudes towards belonging and the role of the university as a space compared to pre-COVID as well?
Absolutely, yeah. And this came through in our data quite a bit. So two things that we noted was the increasing discursive attention to the concept of belonging, which was highlighted in the literature. But actually, you know, anybody who works in teaching and higher education is talking and thinking about this concept right now. But with that, what we noted is then a sort of worry or a concern or an increasing pressure upon teachers as belonging potentially being something else, like another sort of thing in their hat or whatever, that they felt perhaps, oh, is this my responsibility? How can I ensure it? How can I foster it? How can it be measured? How can I feel that I'm doing the right things? A concern about that, and we are also concerned, and that's another reason for why we wanted to highlight in the work how we shouldn't understand it as solely a teacher's responsibility. But the other thing that we noted was that as times moved on and this attention to belonging has increased, students are talking about it and are becoming aware of it and tapping into those discursive conversations. So one particular student that I really always think about in our research said, I didn't really like hearing about this notion of belonging. So they were awarded their place at the university through the predicted grades system after COVID, where some students were given their predicted grades, they couldn't take their exams. And so when she arrived at university, she felt overcome by imposter syndrome, like you were mentioning, Sam. It's really linked to belonging. And actually, she found there was a lot of conversation saying, oh, you know, do you belong here? We're going to make you feel like a sense of belonging, or we're going to encourage it. She found it really, really upsetting. And she said she couldn't connect to it because she didn't feel a sense of belonging. And the more people were talking about it, she felt uncomfortable about it. And for me, that was really revealing in how we're talking about belonging, but actually maybe not always saying, but is it important to you? How do you understand it to the students? And the need to tap into the ways in which those discourses were landing with individual students in diverse ways is really interesting. So absolutely, it's a huge part of the discursive terrain. And I think we need to be careful then that we're continuing to include the diversity of students and staff within those discourses. And I think then, you know, not sort of unintentionally actually working towards exclusionary practices that are making students feel less valued and less like they matter, without meaning to.
No, I guess that's really helpful, Karen. As a follow-up to that, because I think this is something I guess we all experience. Whilst all of us would want student belonging to be very top of our agendas, and there's so many clear links to everything else across the, you know, from a very altruistic point of view to very selfishly, you know, thinking about student retention, etc. Do you think there's a worry among staff, and you touched on it there, that it's another thing that they have to be concerned about? And, you know, to what extent are we all supposed to be doing this? Is this something that personal development tutors should be more thinking about? Is it, yeah, so just even though all of us, I know, care very deeply about our students, to what extent do you think that the terminology, even belonging, is another thing that we have to not worry about, but another thing for us to consider?
Yeah, I think too often, as McClure says, the ideas turn into buzzwords, and then the ways in which those buzzwords are simplified can have unintended consequences that aren't helpful. And the thing about education is that it is messy and difficult. So I think we have to just sit with the discomfort of the difficulty and embrace that uncertainty. And one of the things that came through in our research and that I'm really interested in my work is thinking about not just belonging, but all learning interactions as being relational. So they're not ever just about what the teacher does. Of course, teachers matter, they matter hugely, but they're also about other relational elements that happen within the learning interaction. And that might be the space, it might be the resources that the student can access, it might be the students themselves, it might be other networks of people or things. And all of those things come together to make a relational encounter. And I think if we think about belonging in that way, we absolutely are not letting ourselves off the hook in terms of our ability to foster meaningful connections and learning opportunities for students, but we're also attending to the other elements of the teaching and learning encounter that matter. And I think then that's liberating for me. It's exciting because it puts us back thinking, yeah, there's things that we can do, but also it's not all on our shoulders. This is a really thorny matter of concern that can't be easily addressed with any one particular element.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Karen. So thank you again, Karen, very much for your talk. And everyone, feel free to continue to ask questions of Karen during the chat. So we're going to move on to our final talk in this session now. And I'm just going to invite Jane Pilcher to talk to us about it has such a huge impact on a person's identity and sense of belonging, saying students' names right, practices and policies in higher education in England. Jane, please.
Thank you. Okay, is that visible to everybody? You can see that?
Yeah, I can see that, Jane.
Okay, super. Thanks so much. So I'm Jane Pilcher. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Nottingham Trent University. And today I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Hannah Deakin-Smith, who was the researcher on the project that I'm going to be talking about. So my focus in this talk is the pronunciation of students' names by staff working in higher education. Some context first. I'm a sociologist and I look at people's names to analyse identities and inequalities. So in a 2016 article on the top right of the screen there, I argued that sociology of identity and sociology of body both need to acknowledge that bodies and identities are inextricably intertwined with names, so that rather than just thinking about embodied identities, we actually have to think about embodied named identities. And ethnicities are, of course, an important example of embodied named identities because names convey ethnic and often racialized identities. For example, research by Zweisen and colleagues, which is on the bottom right corner of the screen there, has shown how chances of employment are worse for applicants with names perceived to be non-white names. So the focus of my talk today, pronunciation of students' names by staff working in higher education, comes out of my broader interest in these kinds of issues around identities and inequalities. Why is it important to look at this topic of names in universities? Well, for one thing, names are already seen to matter. Students' names are already seen to matter. So, for example, we have anonymous marking to rule out conscious and unconscious bias, and it's the name that's being erased in anonymous marking and replaced with an identity code or some other code representing that person's identity. And there are also campaigns to cite more women academics and more Black academics, for example. And again, the names of those people are obviously the important thing there. It's also timely now, I think, to focus on the issue of names in universities. So if we look at the data such as this on the screen here, we can see how the sociocultural profile of students has changed over recent decades. There are more international students studying in UK universities, and there are more students of Black, Asian and other minoritized ethnicities studying in universities in the UK. So this kind of data shows us, or it suggests that universities have become less monocultural, less mononational, and less monolingual spaces in recent decades. And alongside that, we might expect there to be a wider diversity of students' names. What do the few studies on names and naming in education show? There's some, like a little clump, if you like, of research around the so-called voluntary renaming that some students do when they're studying in English-speaking universities. So these are typically international students who study in an English-speaking country, in an English-speaking university, and they change their name to an English one. This has been argued to be a pragmatic choice by these students, driven by their worries about how their name will be written and spelt and pronounced by their educators in the host country. There are also some studies from the US on what has been termed students' involuntary naming experiences. And this is where essentially the educators of students mispronounce their students' names. And this has been argued to be an expression of cultural and racialized inequalities of privilege and power, and to be a form of racial microaggression. One Canadian study of university students whose names get mispronounced found that half of the students said it was an issue of importance to them. So if we take all these studies together, primarily from the US or North America, these studies suggest the importance of the pronunciation of students' names for issues of equality, inclusivity, and diversity. And this is an issue, I think it's suggested by the literature, that has a potential influence on students' feelings of belonging and engagement and feelings of inclusion within higher education. So we don't have any evidence on the UK. So this is where my study comes in, the work I did with Hannah. It's the first study of the pronunciation of students' names. It was a small-scale exploratory study comprised of 3 parts. So the first part was a survey of English universities' policy and practice. So of the respondents to that survey, only 2 said that they had any formal policy or guidance around the pronunciation of students' names, and then only at graduation. This survey finding suggests that higher education in England is not engaging systematically with the issue of the pronunciation of students' names. And if it does so, then it's really literally as the students are going out the door at the end of their period of study. The second part of the study was creative writing methods and follow-up interviews with undergraduate students. And the third part, this is the part I'm going to be talking about in this presentation today, interviews with university staff, 5 teaching staff and 5 professional services staff. So these are staff in universities whose role brings them into face-to-face contact with students. Before sharing some findings with you, I just wanted to locate the study in some literature and to briefly say something about the theoretical approach to identities that I used in the study. So we're all aware, of course, all of us in this room today, of the high-profile equalities, diversities, and inclusivity kind of discourses within UK universities. I'm interested in the place of the pronunciation of students' names in this practice and policy landscape. I want to acknowledge the relevance of research which examines the othering of not white ethnicities, as Ade and colleagues put it, in higher education, and also the institutional whiteness of higher education, as Amir puts it. So when we're trying to gain knowledge and understanding about the pronunciation of students' names, I think we need to situate it within that kind of context. we also need to recognise what I call institutional Englishness within universities in England, which results in the minoritisation of, for example, Welsh, Irish and Scottish ethnicities, languages, and also names. Some staff in the study themselves had minoritized ethnicities and minoritized names. The theoretical approach we took around identities was very much an identities as social process approach. So identities of individuals being interactively and collaboratively reproduced through social processes of co-construction and interpretation. So these are processes which involve identity work, which we argue is not just undertaken by individuals themselves in relation to their own identities, but also in relation to the identities of others. So by sustaining and supporting those other people's identities, or conversely, by destabilizing and denigrating them. So names for us are part of this identity work that people do. They're a key part of the identity work that people do, either in relation to our own identities or to the identities of other people. So with all of that in mind then, I now want to turn to some findings from the interviews with higher education staff. So I want to talk about two themes in the data. The first is this issue of how the staff framed the pronunciation of students' names. For them, it was very much an issue of equality and power. So Katie, on the far left of the screen, categorizes some of her colleagues' reactions to the pronunciation of students' names as racialized microaggressions. Sarah, top middle screen, locates the issue around belonging and inclusivity, which is racialized within what Sarah terms the white hegemony of higher education. For Leanne, at the bottom there in the middle, saying students' names right is very much about equality, diversity, and inclusion. Again, because in her view, mispronunciation of names amounts to a disrespecting of identity and impacts badly on students' feelings of belonging. For James, on the right of the screen there, power dynamics in group classroom settings are really important, and especially so for international students. He asks, you know, is a student in a group setting going to put their hand up and say, oh, you're pronouncing my name wrong? So our data around this issue, this theme of equality and power suggests that for staff working in higher education, the pronunciation or that mispronunciation of students' names is a nuanced and complex EDI issue. It's an issue interwoven with myriad networks of privilege and power, including race, ethnicity, nationality, language, age, and role-based status. Staff engagement with trying to say students' names right is an important part of the identity work they do for themselves as good professionals and as morally decent people. But it's also identity work that co-creates the identities of students, as I show next. Okay, so staff in our study reported using a range of different strategies to manage the pronunciation of names they were unsure about, that they were unfamiliar with. Here I'm going to draw on Goffman's dramaturgical theory to identify some front stage strategies and some backstage strategies. So front stage strategies are used in face-to-face or online encounters with students, and typically in group classroom settings. So one strategy here would be to avoid saying a student's name entirely. You're not sure how to pronounce it, you just avoid saying it. And when staff do this, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because they're worried about mispronouncing it, they are nonetheless co-creating those students' identities, albeit negatively. Name avoidance is a form of identity work, which means that the embodied named identities of particular students are not called into being within learning environments. And this reduces students' opportunities for learning because they're not being invited in the same way to participate in classroom activities. Name avoidance is also a strategy which literally erases the ethno-racial and social cultural information that's encoded into students' names. Happily, though, staff mostly reported using identity work strategies that at least helped them to try to say their students' names correctly. And these included the front stage strategy of directly asking students how to say their names. Also some backstage activities where students weren't present. These included making phonetic notes about how to say names, Googling, asking colleagues, and above all, practicing behind the scenes. So via these front stage and backstage strategies, students were not only performing their own professional identities, their own personal identities by doing what Ahmed describes as diversity work, but they're also co-constructing the minoritized identities of students. So let's have a look at some of these, excuse me, there we go. Here's some examples of some of these strategies. So Peter on the far left is talking here about his experiences of avoiding saying students' names because he's unsure of how to say them correctly. So he refers to reconfiguring the sentence or saying the name really quickly or really quietly. Leanne in the top middle is telling us how she directly asks students in one-to-one encounters with them. Being an international student survivor, that's probably her most likely scenario. Lorelei on the bottom middle there also stresses the importance of only asking a student how to pronounce their name in one-to-one settings. To do so in a group setting might be experienced as othering by that student. Iris on the far right there goes into detail about the mix of tools she uses so that she is not othering students with minoritized names. This centers around asking all her students to write their name down and then getting all her students to say their name. This enables Iris to make phonetic notes for her to practice backstage and get it right in the future, in kind of future front stage encounters. Some conclusions then. The findings from my work, my research here, suggest that name pronunciation, mispronunciation is, or at least should be, a key EDI issue. It's also clear that some staff are already doing identity work around names for themselves and for their minoritized students. This is pioneering work. It's pioneering work, great, that's super, but it's also ad hoc, improvised work, and it's largely done on a kind of fingers crossed and hope this is okay kind of basis. And because of this, the identity work that some pioneering staff are doing tends to be hidden from the institutional gaze, and it often has no institutional support whatsoever. So what could and should be changed here? I think there needs to be a shift from front stage identity work to backstage identity work. And alongside this, there should be a shift from the ad hoc individualized strategies made up by staff to whole institutional strategies. And these whole institution strategies must recognize the issue of the pronunciation of students' names as being important, thanks Sam, from registration all the way through to graduation. It's too late just taking care of how to say students' names right at graduation. They've had 3 or 4 years of perhaps of experiencing their name being said wrongly. So it has to be whole institutional. It has to start right from the beginning all the way through to the end. Some specific policy and practice changes might include incorporating names and identities in staff induction programs and in staff EDI training, implementing technological software solutions. So certainly in my institution, we have a students record system where you can have a photograph of your student against their kind of student record, but some student record systems also enable you to upload recordings of people saying their names correctly. And there are, if your student record system doesn't have that facility, there are sort of things you can connect to. There are specific fit for purpose software that you can connect your student record systems to enable you to do that. Another easy fix, or an easier fix perhaps in the software integration solution, is to add audio name badges as kind of a part of the university policy that everyone should have an audio name badge in their email signature. And this way we can normalize declarations of our preferred pronunciations of our names. And you can use Name Coach on the screen there, a free service that Name Coach provides you to do that. So whole institution strategies incorporating these multi-part solutions would shift the work of correctly saying students' names more firmly to the backstage and out of the kind of front stage interacting with student environment. It would help rebalance the significant identity work currently being done by individual student-facing staff, and of course the significant identity work that's being done by students themselves, although I haven't been able to talk about that in this presentation. If you want to find out more about my project on students' names, you've got that QR code where you can go to the project website and download loads of hopefully useful resources for you in your own practice, and to persuade your higher ups in your institutions that this is something that they need to be engaging with. Here are some references that I cited in my talk. Thank you for listening.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jane, for that wonderful talk. Take some questions now. Jane, could I start off with a question, if that's okay?
Sure.
I just want to say I found that incredibly useful for myself, the resources and the research that you shared there. I just wonder, you know how one of the ways as allies, one of the things that we can do with the LGBTQ plus community is to have our own, even if we ourselves identify as cisgendered like myself, we'd have our pronouns as creating a safe space to identify ourselves to others as well. I wonder, do you think something that we could also do is people that have names that might appear to be easy to pronounce, such as myself, we could have at the bottom of our own email signatures a link to this is how you pronounce our name, to help normalize that approach, rather than again singling out people who we think should have to explain how to pronounce their name as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much where my suggestion comes from, that kind of space. And you know, my own name, Jane Pilcher, you know, that might be thought to be easy to be announced, but I know I've had interaction with Spanish colleagues who can't get the Jane bit right because of the way the J's is pronounced in Spanish. So we shouldn't ethnocentrically assume that our name is unproblematic for everybody to pronounce. And exactly as you're saying, it kind of like just normalizes the declarations in the same way that we're hoping to normalize the declaration of pronouns.
And I guess just as a follow-up question to that as well, from your encounters with the students, did you find that, what were their attitudes towards staff that were really trying to do all of these things, but kept getting the pronunciation wrong, but then kept trying to get it right, if that makes sense? Was the understanding that maybe for some people it might be difficult and take time to learn how to get the pronunciation correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to speak too much about the student findings here in this context, but one of the things the students did were distinguish between, meeting a person on a one-off basis and a person saying their name wrong on a single occasion, and they're not likely to meet that person again. So it wasn't a big, didn't want to make a fuss, didn't want to make a big deal about it. But when you're interacting with a person over a period of time, for students, that did begin to matter more. And they did really appreciate it when staff, were clearly making an effort to say their names correctly, and they appreciated them taking the time and trouble to respect their identities. And it was very irritating for some students when staff persistently just kept saying their name wrong and they weren't making an effort to learn how to say it properly. Or they said things like, oh, well, I'll just call you XYZ in place of your name. No. So renaming them to make it easier for the staff to pronounce. So yes, the effort is appreciated by students.
And again, just sorry to dominate the conversation, because I experience this on a daily basis. From what you talked about, if you could just expand on, is it not appropriate then from the research you've been doing, and would students prefer us not to repeatedly ask how to pronounce their name in a group setting, but for that to be done in a one-to-one setting instead?
Yeah, absolutely. They feel like the spotlight's on them, and any sort of difference in terms of that they're already feeling is just accentuated when in a classroom setting, you're sort of asked to clarify how to say your own name. You might be the only brown student in the class, and you're also now being asked to say your name. So students definitely did experience it as othering. And some of the staff members we were speaking to, it was only when we were asking them about what the strategies were, they said, oh my God, I've just realized I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't be asking them in front of other students. I should, have a quiet word with them after class and, do it in a one-to-one meeting and not in front of a whole class of students. So yeah, it's definitely avoid that one.
Thanks, Jane.
That's one
Charlie.
That's one of our top 10 tips is don't.
No, that's
don't
really
do that.
helpful. No, of course, as soon as you reflect on it.
Hi, Charlie, I recognise that face.
Hi, Jane, nice to see you. I just wanted to ask in terms of whether you considered how practical it was for departments, as a sort of EDI focus to actually have these conversations, because it seems if this is happening one-on-one between every student and every academic lecturer or teacher or administrator, how practical is it that this could form part of the way in which departments approach meeting students' needs?
I think if it's embedded in training, then it becomes something that is practical. If there's just some signalling by the university itself through having a mandate about including your audio name badge in your email signature, I've had some success in my institution at having some training workshops for particularly staff who work with international students, but also the dean for students in my school had an induction for students, because it's a good icebreaker for students when they first arrive at university to have well, what are names? How do they link to our identities? And you can I think you need to raise the profile of names and the importance for identities per se. I mean, I've focused here today on pronunciation, but one of the big findings again from our students was, name ordering. That varies across cultures, and university systems, administrative systems, email protocols aren't always as sensitive as they need to be to the differences in name ordering. So for some cultures, your family name comes first and your first name comes second. So there's issues around email protocols. So it's the issue of names and identities is importantly about pronunciation, but there are a whole set of other issues to do with it too, in terms of respecting people's identities through respecting and understanding that naming conventions typical in English universities aren't necessarily what all our students are going to be familiar with and experience themselves.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And Jane, I wonder if, I know you presented your top tips there as well, but will this work be further developed and like maybe presented as a framework or something to be shared more broadly across the universities for guidance? Because I know it's something we'd find very useful, certainly at our university.
Yeah, I mean, trying to get impact from our work is a it's a big mountain to climb. But I've had something published in the Times Higher around this issue. I've got blog posts to write for various organisations, including the one that's behind this conference today. So I'm doing lots of efforts to try and get my work out there more widely. All the universities, for example, who took part in the survey were sent the top 10 tips for practitioners in classroom settings, but also for policymakers in university settings too. So yeah, I'm trying to get it out there and get it more widely recognised.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jane. So just a comment a question from Ella. First of all, Jane, do you have a link to your research page rather than the QR code that you could maybe
I can put that in the chat probably before we go, or I can make it available some other way.
If you're able to put in the chat, that'd be great, Jane. Thank you. And then I'll just read from Vesna. So he says, very interesting research, thank you. Nice to hear that students appreciate our efforts to learn their name pronunciation. I try this in my teaching with international students, and not all want to bother, but others with it. But I agree, this is very important EDI work. Thank you. So conscious that we need to finish on time to make sure that the technical team have got ready for the rest of the afternoon. I just wanted to say thank you very much to Jane and to Karen and to myself for excellent talks in this session. There was real congruence, I think, between all of them. Just to remind everyone, there's a whole packed afternoon and early evening of activities in the rest of the digital conference, and that we've got a break now until 2 p.m. GMT time, UK time. And then from 2 to 2:30, we'll go into the networking session. So again, thank you very much. Thank you to Winnie for doing the technical behind the scenes. Thank you to Karen and to Jane for some wonderful talks. Thank you all of you for your questions. Please continue to connect with each other through email and through various social media, etc. And thank you for your time. Stay safe, be well, and speak to you all soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.